I'm Judith Flanders. I am the historical consultant for Assassin's Creed. And in the daytime, when I'm not being an Assassin's Creed consultant, I write Victorian social history, so 19th century British social history. Yeah, I want them to do nothing else so that I can have a job full time. I haven't been able to persuade them of this yet, but I'm working on it. What was really interesting about working on Assassin's Creed, I've worked a little bit on television adaptations to do historical dramas. And the difference was astonishing because the other work I've done, they always see the history people as the enemy. They're the people who tell them they can't do something. And what was wonderful about working with the Assassin's Creed people was they kept saying, "Oh, that's wonderful, tell us more. No, we could do that. That would be great." And they were so open and so interested in the period that they just wanted more all the time. They wanted to do more and they wanted more detail. It was wonderful. Well, I don't know anyone else that I can talk to about sewers.
Sewers?
Well, they were very important in Victorian London. You had 3.5 million people, and until just before this game begins, no sewage system. So you had a lot of typhoid, you had a lot of death, and you had a lot of stink. There was one year that, about 10 years before this game, the river, which is where all the sewage went, because it was very hot, there was so much sewage in it that the river fermented.
It just the great stink.
It was the great stink. And so what happened with the great stink is it created the understanding that they needed to do something about this. And what I was interested in seeing the Assassin's Creed, the finished product, is you see there are scenes along the river, on the north bank of the river, which in the few years just before this game takes place, they built out into the river, and on top are parks and a road and other things, but underneath are the first modern sewers in the whole world. So apart from the Assassin's Creeders, I have no one to talk to about sewers. Overall picture was set by the time I came on board. They had most of the big visuals. I spent a lot of time describing, for instance, what shop fronts would have looked like, or how many women they should see on the streets, or various visual elements. For instance, those signs that they have that say stockbroker or bankers or whatever. We discussed what those should look like. We discussed how various people used the streets and where they should appear. But then, yes, I worked on very small levels, like the when you crash a carriage, what the passers-by should say. And I think one of the reasons they came to me in the first place, there are, after all, many wonderful Victorian historians, but I've always been interested in the detail. What did it look like? What did it sound like? What did it smell like? You know, many historians are interested in the government or the laws or wars or famine. I'm interested in how did they get rid of sewage? Because I think those are the things that matter to us on an everyday level. Those are the things we care about. You know, how did the public transport work? We're sitting in this carriage. I want to know, how did the coachman get up on front? And given that I've just tried it, with enormous difficulty. You know, it's that kind of small detail that interests me. It wasn't a very well-paid job. And so usually what they were people who didn't have very many employment prospects. They were usually drunks. Because you couldn't leave a horse standing in the street, they had to have stands where the horses could be fed and watered and kept warm while they were waiting for somebody who wanted a cab. They were usually by pubs. So if nobody wanted a cab, the cabman spent most of his day in the pub, which meant that by the time somebody called for a cab, he was dead drunk. Because he was dead drunk, he lost his license. So because he lost his license, he got even more drunk. So by the time he got his license back, this was not a good job. No, they had done most of the work on the fashion before I got involved. Occasionally, we discussed, one of the things that we talked about quite a lot was this thing that, of course, everyone wore hats. And while we know from fashion historians that everyone wore hats, they had the very good question is, what did they do with the hats when they went inside? Where did they put all these hats? And so, as I say, it's detail like that. So I found them, for instance, a picture of an 1870s restaurant, a very upmarket restaurant. And above each of the tables, there's like the rack you have on a train where you put your or on the airplane where you put your luggage. But what men did was they put their hats upside down, they slid them in. And there is this restaurant, actually it's Le Train Bleu in Paris, which the interiors have survived. And so you have these hat racks. So it was that kind of detail that I worked on rather than it's quite easy to find in 1868 women's skirts looked like. More complicated is finding out how they kept them out of the mud in the street.
How did they?
Mostly they didn't. And that was a big problem because if they held them up out of the mud, which they did a bit, if they held them up too high, people thought they were prostitutes looking for customers. And so there was always this thing for women in public, comfort versus men coming up and offering to pay for sex.
Oh my.
Yeah, well, the language has changed enormously, and of course, particularly in script writing, it's the daily language. The language of fiction, of written English, is much more similar. But the language we speak colloquially every day is very different. And I've been aware of it. I have an English mother who's lived in Canada for 50 years. And I've been here for 30 years, and she says half the time she doesn't know what I'm talking about because the slang I use is not the slang she knew as a girl. And so we're very fortunate in, for scholars, I obviously don't know about Finnish. The Oxford English Dictionary, what we call the Big Oxford, which is sort of 18 volumes, it's like a regular dictionary. It tells you the word, it tells you what the word means, it tells you where it comes from. But then you have examples. So the first use of the word that they have managed to track back. So when they used a word like, say, manpower, which I thought wasn't a 19th century word, I could look in the Big Oxford and see, actually, yes, they had used it in the 19th century. Or the opposite way today, when we have a drink, everyone picks up their glass and says cheers. Surprisingly, that's 20th century. No one said that in the 19th century. So I actually had to find them words for that, which was more complicated than it sounds. Even more so with war or revolution. I mean, I know somebody whose mother came from Russia in 1917, and he speaks, because he learned from her, pre-revolution Russian. People say it's like listening to a ghost. Nobody speaks like that. It sounds frightening. So I think that happens, and of course the other thing that happens, which I worked a lot on, is the swearing changes. And luckily for me, there is a 3-volume dictionary of historical slang. So I could work out the 47 ways of saying fuck you, because it changes. I was speaking to one of the development team because they'd asked for some swearing, and I sent them a very long email of such obscenity. I thought it wouldn't get through their spam filters. And she said, oh, because they kept being told that, Victorians didn't use words like this. She said she stuck it up on the wall. She said, Judith says it's okay. It's fabulous. And now you have to understand I'm not a gamer. So I had to have a lesson first. And somebody forgot to tell me what half the buttons do. So I wasn't very good at it. But part of the problem, part of the reason I wasn't very good at it is that intellectually I know these things, but I've never seen them because you can't. So this is as close as I'm ever going to get to seeing it. So I don't want to fight these people. I don't want to kill these people. I want to look at the posters on the wall. There were workmen working on scaffolding, in the background. And I said, yes, that's what the scaffolding looked like. That's exactly what it looked like. And of course, I've barely ever seen this. So it was magic.